morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. Welcome to New Orleans and TC18. Hope you all enjoyed Devs on Stage this morning. Some features you liked, yeah? Good, good. So my name is Ross Bunker. I'm a principal engineer at Tableau. I've been at Tableau for 13 years now. Worked on a lot of different areas of the product, connectivity, table calculations, web client, data blending, LOD calculations. But for me, my passion is really around helping people answer more questions with Tableau. And this idea of the questions you use in Tableau is what really fascinates me. And so what I want to talk to you today about is a way of sort of systematically breaking down your questions so that you can figure out what features in Tableau to use, what fields to use, because sometimes when you sit in front of Tableau and you've got a blank canvas and you've got this list of fields on the left, you have a question in your mind, but you're not really sure how to turn that into a visualization. So that's what I will spend our time on today, and hopefully have you come away with an ability to systematically analyze your questions and be able to apply what you know about Tableau more quickly and efficiently to generate answers. So at Tableau, our passion, as you know, is helping people see and understand data. Now the C part of this is pretty obvious, right? We're a visual tool. We build graphical visualizations of your data to help you see things. But what do we mean by understand? So understand, if you look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, this is one of the definitions. And I think the key here is really this idea of the significance or cause, right? And how do we find causes of things? How do we find explanations? Well, we ask questions and we look for answers. And so when we talk about understanding, we're really talking about that process of question and answer. So what I want to do is start off by really looking deeply at questions and breaking them down, understanding how the pieces of the question impact what your answer is going to be, and really trying to get down in some of the nitty-gritty detail of what different parts of the question are important and which ones aren't. Then we'll go through a simple process of answering some questions with Tableau, looking at some questions and looking at some visualizations and understanding how the two are related. Now we're not going to cover all the features of Tableau. I'm not going to really talk about how to use Tableau, those features. There's lots of other talks that go into hands-on training and all that sort of thing. But what I want to give a sense of is how you can map the different types of questions you have into the features of Tableau. And so we'll summarize at the end with kind of a chart that tries to capture at least some of that. And again, it's not comprehensive, it's not total or complete, but it at least maybe gives you a framework and a structure that you can use in your own use of Tableau to start building your own sort of process for doing this systematically. And I'll also talk a little bit about some of the future features that we want to introduce that are going to help make this process even easier. All right, so let's start off by talking about questions. Now, word of warning, I'm going to get a little bit into grammar, nothing huge. I'm not a linguist or anything like that. But I think this is the most useful way of really thinking about Tableau and really understanding what are the important parts of a question and what parts of a question aren't important. I promise there will be no sentence diagramming for those of you that have traumatized childhoods, but we'll get a little bit into nouns and verbs and things. So the natural way when I started thinking about this to think about questions was thinking about question words. We grow up sort of with these ideas of who, what, when, where, why, how, the 6 W's and 1 H. So if we look at these individually, we can kind of get a sense of how they impact things. So what is a great place to start, and it talks, it's the things your question are about. What were the best-selling cars of 1990? But it can also be the attributes of things. So not just the things themselves like cars, but also the types of cars, the makes of cars. Sometimes it's actually a placeholder for the verb. So what happened, right? So there, you don't know what happened. There's something that happened. It maybe went up, maybe it went down. It's a placeholder for the verb. And sometimes we use which instead of what. Which cars sold the best. So those are sort of interchangeable. Similarly, who is, semantically in our language, this is a person. But really, in terms of data, it's just another what, right? Person or car, the data doesn't really distinguish between those, even though we do in our language. But semantics are actually definitely very interesting, and I'll talk a little bit at the end about how bringing semantics into Tableau will be able to help us do a better job with this. So the next one I'm going to talk about is when. So when obviously brings time into the equation, right? You probably want to use a timeline. You're asking something about when things happen. When did sales increase? But it might also be prediction. When will sales level off? So this requires some inference. This starts to talk about things like forecasting and modeling, machine learning, those sorts of things. But I did notice that time series is not always indicated by when, right? Sometimes I might say, in what year did the most cars sell? So here, it's not when that tells me that this is about time, it's the word year. So when can introduce time, but maybe isn't always a great indicator of that. So where is kind of the complement to when, only instead of time, we're talking about space. I've got location analysis. Where are my sales the strongest? But note that it doesn't always mean a map, right? So if I have a question like, where do I sell the most staplers? Probably the best thing is a bar chart with sorted so that I can see where staplers, or what state maybe staplers sold the most in. But definitely, we do like to use maps, geospatial stuff, when we have locality questions. So does proximity to California affect delivery times? So I want to be able to see in this result the idea of locality, proximity. Is this close to that? And so we really need that on a map so that we can see that. But just like when, spatial's not always indicated by where. My proximity question there doesn't have the word where in it. Similarly, what sales had the highest state? What state has the highest sales? There's no where there, but it's clearly about space because I use the word states. Why is the next question. It's a great question. It's one children ask a lot, and for which we sometimes struggle to find answers, and computers are even worse. So, why questions don't usually come from Tableau, or the answers to why questions don't come from Tableau. Why questions are often about causation inference, and really this is where your job security is. This is what people are for. People are for answering the why questions. Now we use all the other questions we ask of Tableau to come up with those, but the why questions themselves aren't necessarily what Tableau is best at. And finally, how. These come in a variety of shapes and flavors. How come my profits went down is actually more of a why question. Why did my profits go down? But a lot of times it introduces these different ideas of quantity, magnitude, and frequency. How many staplers? How far do my customers live? How long between ordering and delivery? And so those types of questions, often by how. But really, the focus shifts to the rest of the question, right? In these examples I have here, the words sell, live, between, and run out are really the things that are most interesting. So my big takeaway in looking at this initially from this idea of these introductory question words is they don't matter. They don't matter one bit. They sometimes can give you a hint, like some of those when and where questions. But really, if you look at the rest of the sentence, whether it's when or where doesn't matter, right? It's the states and other things like that that give you that sense. The nouns and the verbs are really the words that matter. And so that's where we're going to focus our attention. And in particular, it kind of gets to the idea that a lot of, well, not a lot necessarily, but a number of the words in your question really don't necessarily add any meaning or help you in figuring out how to build a visualization. So we're going to try and focus on the words that do matter. So for that, we're going to start with verbs. So verbs are one of the most important ones, and they'll really help key you in typically on what it is you're measuring. So sometimes the verb itself is what you're measuring. So how many cars were purchased last month, right? So I'm measuring car purchases. And so that's what I want to focus my question on. But sometimes it's not the verb itself. How did sales do this year, right? So passive verbs in particular don't necessarily point you directly at things, but then the subject or the object of that verb can help you. So what is it your verb is connected to? Is it in this case, sales? So that's really telling me I'm measuring sales. Similarly, sometimes the verbs don't necessarily point you at a single measure, but can point you at either multiple measures or multiple things that you want to compare. So comparison verbs like how does market spend affect sales? I'm measuring marketing and sales, and I want to compare them to one another. How did this month's sales compare to last month's? I'm taking the sales and comparing these 2 months. Which products sold better or worse this month? So I'm looking for up and down trends. That takes me to change, which is another way that verbs can tell us a little bit about what it is we're asking, what kind of answer we want. How many salaries went up or down this year? When did sales start to rise? How long after purchase do cars lose their value? So again, these are verbs are telling us, what it is we want to see, what it is we want to measure, but they're also pointing at these words, salaries, sales, and cars, which are telling us a little bit about the measure that we want to use. So that's the verbs. Nouns are the next most important thing. So the nouns are often the dimensions in your question. They may not just be the subject of the question, so which employees sold the most cars in each city. So here, employees is the subject, but city is an important word here, right? And it's telling me a little bit about the dimensions that I want to include in my visualization. Sometimes some of these nouns are implicit with the verb. So what were sales like last year? I really mean what were home sales like, or maybe what were car sales like. So have to know, and sometimes we have words that are implicit that we need to bring in to really clarify our question. We'll talk about that a little bit. So our nouns are important. There's some other nouns that show up sometimes. Sometimes they show up as adjectives instead of nouns. But these words are particularly interesting, and they're the domain words. So by domain, what I mean is that these are words which are not necessarily fields in my data source, like state or city, but rather values in the data. So things like Seattle, Washington, stapler, dates. These are often preceded by keywords like in, on, among. And what those are doing is sort of cluing you into the fact that there's some kind of domain operation going on here. Sometimes these will qualify the dimension, like I might say the blue cars or the large filing cabinets, or something like that, in which case they become adjectives. But the domain words are really useful because those are things that are going to key you into a certain way of using Tableau, and they're fundamentally different than those other types of words. So there's a few other classes of words that I want to talk about. Adjectives show up typically modifying your nouns, since that's what they're for. And those are going to key us into other ways of using Tableau. First order, last year, blue cars, years. Another kind of word is a superlative. So these show up often, best, worst, best-selling, most, least. These kinds of things clue you into other particular features of Tableau. Qualifiers are ways of separating parts of the sentence, parts of your question. And those qualifiers are going to key you into particular features of Tableau that are going to isolate separate pieces of your question into phrases. And those phrases are going to be unique in some way to affect how you want to use Tableau. So for example, for customers that bought staplers, how many also bought chairs? So here, this idea that these customers bought staplers is a separate piece. It's distinct from the rest of my question, and that qualifier is what clues me into that. So we want to talk about relative clauses. Had to get a little creative with my image. Turns out there aren't a lot of images about relative clauses. But in any case, the important relative clauses are often introduced by those qualifiers I mentioned, and what they do is they sort of give you important information about the nouns in your question. And they may be used with or without a comma, but those things stand as sort of these separate groups of words together. And those really are important because they point you at features of Tableau that are fundamentally different than just the viz itself. They'll point you at things like filters and LOD calculations and other sorts of features of Tableau that are sort of doing analysis outside of the rest of your visualization. And then finally, there's some special comparison words that key you into specific types of visualizations that you might want to use. So, change over time. How does this year compare to last year? Spatial analysis. How do employee costs relate to urban areas? And part-whole analysis. How does one state's sales compare to the average for all the states? So these are different types of visualizations. They're different types of analyses that you can do in Tableau, and different features of Tableau really help you use these specific types of things. Now, this list is not comprehensive. There's some other ones. These are the most common. And as you use your own data, you can sort of build out this list of types of questions and give yourself a template for how to apply your knowledge of Tableau to your specific set of problems. Okay, so we've kind of looked at questions a lot. I've sort of hinted at a lot of things that are important in terms of how you use features of Tableau. Let's go ahead and answer some questions. Now, I thought about what type of question to answer, and I could have pulled up Superstore sales, and we could have looked at staplers some more. We could have looked at some sort of relevant piece of information. But I thought I would get, personal and talk about something that affects me. So these are my kids. I have 4 of them. We also have 2 adults in the house. And the oldest one, that would be the one in the chicken suit, is now driving. And so we have 3 drivers. So with this many people needing to get places, 2 cars is not enough. So we're going to work on a question related to our family getting another car. Now, we could talk about who should get the car. Really, this is going to be, family car. We're going to share. It's not my dream car or anything like that. We could talk about what car to get. But as it turns out, we already have, a big car that can hold everybody. And that car uses a lot of gas. And being in Seattle, we want to be eco-conscious. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to get a car that uses less gas, an electric car. And Tesla just came out with their Model 3, which is the lower, less expensive one. But of course, they're on order. And so the question I want to look into is, when will our family Tesla arrive? Now, in order to answer this, we need to find some data, right? So choosing your data is actually one of the first steps that you have to do to answer questions in Tableau. And and in order to do that, you have to understand what things are in the questions you have and make sure those things are represented in the data that you're getting. So my question is about Tesla reservations and orders and deliveries. And in particular, I wanted to get an all-wheel drive version because we have hills in Seattle, it snows sometimes, we need to be able to get around. So I was able to go out and find some data like this. But what I want to measure is this idea of when is it coming? So I have to make sure it has delivery information. So what I want to do is look at the relationship between when somebody ordered a car and when it's being delivered. And then with that, I can go and find it. And luckily, so it turns out that on the Tesla forums, there's somebody who put up a Google form where people can go in and enter their reservation information. And then when they finally get to order their Tesla and when it gets delivered, they can fill that in. And so there's this lovely little data set. Now, it's not representative of all of Tesla whatsoever. It's totally self-reported. But I'm hopeful that it's sort of, randomized enough that it will be representative. Now, I want to take a quick moment and talk a little bit about level of detail and your data source. One of the important things when you choose your data is to understand what your question is about, because some data is not going to be able to answer your questions. For example, if you have questions about daily stock trades, and you go out and you collect data that is about monthly stock appreciation, you're not going to be able to answer those daily questions. Similarly, if you have questions about your employees and you go out and you get information from the sales database, well, it may have information about your employees in it, but when you start asking it questions, it's going to probably be at the wrong level of detail. So you saw in the Vision keynote demo, we have the new feature coming enabling better data modeling, and so that helps. But until that arrives, and even when it does, it's good to be cognizant of making sure that the questions you have and the data you have are in alignment. Okay, so with that, let's go into Tableau. So here's the data that I have. Oops. Let's go here. So I have this all-wheel drive order tracker data. It's got information about where people are, whether or not it's been whether or not it has a delivery scheduled, when they ordered it, when they placed the reservation. So I think with all of this information, I should be able to answer questions. So what we're going to do is look at a bunch of questions that I came up with, and just look at how that question manifests in Tableau as a visualization. So the first question is just how many reservations are there in this data set, right? And so this is a very simple question. I really, don't have a lot of things, and the resulting visualization is very simple as well, right? I have one field, which is what is it I'm measuring? I'm measuring the number of reservations. So the next question I had was about what is the earliest reservation in the system? So this is when Tesla first started taking orders. I do have the superlative here. And in this case, the way that manifested was as a min for my question. I wasn't asking about the average reservation date, right? I wanted the earliest, so that became the min. Again, fairly simple. This is not a tricky viz. Similarly, I want to know what's the earliest scheduled delivery date. So again, I have a min. In this case, I'm using the scheduled date instead of the reservation date in order to figure out what it is I'm measuring. So now we're starting to get a little trickier, or a little more complex data. So I adjust to my screen size here. These monitors are never as big as the ones at my desk. So now I've actually got a couple of things going on here. So I've got more pills, right? I'm looking at percent of reservations, right? So I've got a little part hole analysis going on. And I have this delivery scheduled piece of the question. So I'm asking about reservations, but I'm comparing the ones that have a delivery versus the ones that don't. So I have this bar chart, which lets me do that comparison, and I have this field has delivery out to help me distinguish that. And so what I've done here is used a table calculation to do my percent of total. So when we see things like percents and part whole analysis, table calculations are something you often want to use. So 65% of the reservations still haven't had deliveries yet. One of those was me. But so now let's look a little bit at location information. Come on. There we go. So one of the questions I have is, Washington is nice and has a lot of people in Seattle that have ordered Teslas, so maybe more are getting delivered there. Maybe that gives me some hope that I'll get mine soon. And we can see here California obviously has the most. They probably have the most orders as well. It's Tesla's home state, not in addition to being large. And Washington is on here. So if we look at the viz, we do have state in here, but this isn't a map because I'm which ones have the most. I've got that superlative, and so I've sorted it, right? So the most has indicated to me that I probably want to sort it so that I can see this ordering. And as with many of the others, I'm looking at reservations, so I have my sum of number of records. And here, though, I've said with a delivery scheduled. So where before I had the has delivery out there as a field that gave me the comparison between true and false, here I've chosen to just use it as a filter, so I can just see the ones that do have a delivery scheduled. I'm measuring something slightly different. And by filtering to true here, I'm measuring the ones that have a delivery rather than the ones that, just the ones that don't. Okay, so this tells me a little bit more. But really what I want to know is, Washington is near California, so maybe we'll get ours sooner. So that's where we start to get into the proximity question. So does proximity to California affect delivery? So I've got California in there, even though, so I can see where that is, and but I can probably make this question a little more specific to help me build a visualization. Really what I'm asking is, does the number of deliveries vary by proximity to California? And so California here, it's one of those domain words, but what it's really keyed me in onto is the fact that I care about states and I care about location. So I've got a map. I've got location on the viz to help me get that state information. I've got my number of deliveries indicated by the size. And because I've got proximity out here, I've got it on a map, so I can see that. So one of the things that I did here is I took this question, which was very natural for me to ask, and I made it much more specific. And so that step can often help you to really nail it down, particularly if you're getting questions from other people that you're turning into a visualization. It can really help to really nail down some of those words that can be ambiguous because the way they mean some word may not be the same. And so by looking at your data and looking at the question, you can make sure that you've got an understanding of how the words in the question map to your data and to the fields in your visualization. So what this visualization is telling me is that, well, it doesn't seem like being in Washington is of any particular help, right? New York and some of these other East Coast states seem to have circles about the same size. So, okay, fair enough. Good job, Tesla, at being fair. So another thing that I have going for me is that I did put my reservation in early. I don't remember if it was on the first day or the next morning, but if we look at number of reservations by period, so there were sort of the day 1 reservations, the day 2 reservations, day 2 and 3, and then kind of the rest of 2016, and then 2017, 2018. You can see these were front-loaded, right? First couple of days had the most reservations. Those people sitting there waiting to click the button. So the question is, since I ordered early, is that going to help me? So let's look at that. So here we've got how does reservation period affect the likelihood of delivery? So there's some fuzziness here, right? What does likelihood of delivery really mean? And so if we look at this rephrasing of the question, maybe a little bit better. Display. Boy, it's hard to get that spot. Okay, happens to us too. How does the period of the reservation affect whether its delivery has been scheduled, right? So this is a little clearer description of the question. And so if we look at the fields that I put on the viz, I've got reservation period because I'm asking about periods. I have the reservation count because that's what I'm looking at. And then I've got a question about whether its delivery has been scheduled. And so I have that Boolean, whether or not it has a delivery scheduled out here. Now, I've done this as a stacked bar chart. It's a little more compact and fits on the screen better. I could also put this as an unstacked bar chart. And if we focus in on one day so that it's not quite so small, you know, this lets me compare that really easily, right? I can compare it this way too, and you know, I can still judge pretty well which bars are larger and smaller, and this way I can see it. So what's interesting here is that, yeah, it seems like more of the first day reservations have happened, but you know, there also were more of them, so it's not really clear that having reserved earlier really helps much. Now, the one thing that this doesn't show is the fact that when Tesla started delivering, they started delivering a particular model first, right? The non-all-wheel drive long range. So I would suspect that many of these later orders, which are being fulfilled more quickly, were probably for those particular types of cars. So once they made those available, people were willing to do that. So, you know, I still have some hope that maybe being an early reserver will help me a bit. So we've looked at two things, states and when I made the reservation, to try and understand if that's going to help me. But let's really dig in now and look at deliveries by state. So here I have probably the most complicated question I've asked so far. For initial reservations, how many deliveries are scheduled per week in each state, right? So we have a bunch of things going on here. So we have this for initial reservations. So this is one of the clauses that I talked about. So how does this manifest in Tableau? Well, what I'm asking about, right, is I want to focus in on reservations which were made early. So how do we do that in Tableau? We do that with a filter. So this clause is basically telling me to restrict my data to those initial reservations. And so indeed, I have a filter to just day one. I'm asking about deliveries as usual, and so I have my typical sum of number of records out there. And I'm asking about scheduled per week. So what I have here is the field scheduled delivery date, and I'm looking at it at the week level. And then I have this on a per state basis, and so I have location out on the viz. So each element of this question is represented by pills in the viz, and they're being mapped to these different features. Now, I've also got a filter on location here because there are some states that don't have any scheduled deliveries, and I didn't want them cluttering it up. Now, that's where these 31, or that's where some of these nulls are from. Now, the reality here is it's very hard to see anything. So I'm going to further restrict this to deliveries in Washington. I could, if I didn't want to do that necessarily, I could edit this question and say, for initial reservations, how many deliveries are scheduled per week in each state? Let's see. With count of scheduled deliveries greater than, let's pick some number 10. So we've updated the viz here, so it's now restricted the states. So what did we do? Well, what we did essentially, as far as the question goes, is take this state piece and add a clause to it. We said 4 states with total number of deliveries at least 10. Right? And so that's what putting that filter did. And so we can use filters, in particular condition filters, to take those nouns like state and apply clauses to them to restrict them to some subset that is interesting to your question. But I really want to focus in on Washington because that's where I live. So here we can see that we've basically taken the previous viz and we've really just filtered it down to Washington, right? So again, Washington being one of those domain words. So domain words really often end up with having you filter because typically what you're doing is you're restricting, again, one of your nouns to some subset. And the simplest way to do that is with a filter. So good news is there are more deliveries and they seem to be ramping up. So let's focus in on reservations, or look at the percentage, right? Because again, this is sample data, and so I'm not really interested in the total number. I really want to know what is the percentage of these that have actually been completed. That'll give me a sense of where I might fall. So what we can see here is that I've again taken that same viz, so I have my initial reservations filter. I'm looking at percent of reservations now, so I've introduced a table calculation. All right, so I'm doing delivery percentage with table across. And I can show you that calculation. So I wrote this calculation to compute the percent of reservations scheduled for delivery. So we have the total sum number of records, which is my total number of reservations. And then we have this total delivered. So what is total delivered? Total delivered is a running sum. Because what I want to know is not how many were delivered this week, but as we got to this week, how many total have been delivered? So I'm generating a running sum. And so the good news here is that it looks like we're running at about, each week they're now up to 15% per week. And so I was doing this analysis towards the end of September, second to last week of September. So if they just continued at this rate, they're at almost, they would be, sometime in the next 3 weeks, as of mid-September, I should get my delivery as well. And I'm happy to report that indeed, in early October, we took delivery, and it's been great. I was hoping there would be some suspense when I got here, and nobody, and I wouldn't know if I'd gotten it yet or not, but they did a good job. So I want to take one quick moment now to talk about one other thing, which is your target audience, right? So we've talked so far about you asking questions and generating visualizations, or maybe somebody has asked you a question and you're generating a visualization for them. But another way that we use Tableau is to generate interactive dashboards where other people can ask questions of them. And so there are a number of features in Tableau that lend themselves to that process. So I wanted to show an example of that. But the key thing to think about here is that depending on your target audience, you're going to want to shape your visualization accordingly. So if you're presenting a static dashboard to somebody, consider that. If you want to present an interactive dashboard that you drive, or if you're in Tableau and you're demoing or showing them stuff and you need to be able to edit it quickly, you can do that. Or if you're presenting a dashboard to publish to your organization so that other people can ask questions, you can do that. So I took this dashboard, or this visualization, and I created this one. I'll put myself in presentation mode so we have a little more space. So what I've done is I've replaced some of the pieces of that visualization with quick filters. So in this case, I took the that initial reservation filter, and I turned it into a quick filter so that that piece of the question could be something that the user can manipulate themselves. Similarly, I took the state and made that into a quick filter so that a user could edit that themselves. And so it becomes a sort of parameterized question, not to be confused necessarily with Tableau parameters, although that's certainly one thing you can use to do this. But it becomes a question that's now adaptable to whatever the user wants. And so there are a number of features in Tableau that can help you do that. Not only parameters and quick filters, but also actions. And as you saw with the set actions and parameter actions today, there's increasing ways of creating interactivity within Tableau. Okay. So this is kind of a breakdown of this process that we walked through. So you start off and try to identify the verbs and nouns that indicate what you want to measure. Then you can figure out the other nouns in the question that are going to basically indicate to you what fields and dimensions you want in your visualization. Then you want to key in on those relative clauses and qualifiers. Sometimes you need to build filters for those. Other times you may use sets or LOD calculations to make computations on the side that are independent of the rest of the visualization. And those clauses are the things that key you into those. Then you want to think about the analytical style you want to apply. So use maps to show spatial proximity. Use timelines for time-based questions. Sort for superlatives and comparisons. Totals and reference lines can be used for part-whole analysis. And table calculations for comparison over time or part-whole. And then finally, you can augment an audience-targeted dashboard with appropriate features for that interactivity. You can use filter controls, parameters, and actions to allow users to customize the questions. So I've tried to summarize some of this in this thing, and I'm going to move quickly so nobody takes a picture. No, I'll come back. Basically, I've tried to list some features on the left side, which are Tableau features. And across the top, different parts of your question or elements of the question, and then try to fill in this table to give you an idea of what features of Tableau to use in different situations. Again, this isn't a complete picture. There are some features of Tableau that maybe aren't listed here. There's some more nuanced elements of questions. But you can apply this same methodology to your Tableau usage. And over time, you can build up kind of a flow chart or a pattern, a process for building questions. And then anytime you get a new question, you can fit it to those patterns and very quickly identify what kind of visualization you want to do. So I think a lot of people do this somewhat naturally, and this is how they get better and better at Tableau. But by really making it rigorous and really thinking concretely about it, I think it can really help you do it even faster and more completely. Okay, everybody's got their phones down, so we'll move on. So a little bit about the future. So as you saw on Tuesday morning, we're releasing Ask Data. And so you might think of what I've described here as sort of manual natural language processing. And so what we're trying to do, though, with Ask Data is make that automatic, right? And again, one of the great things about Ask Data is that it's really a jumping off point, right? You can start by asking your question. Then you can take that visualization that it generates, jump into Tableau, and keep going. And so it's a great way to get things started and kick things off. Part of that, though, is this idea of a richer semantic model. So in prep, they showed you this idea of being able to tag things as URLs or other types of data and even custom types of data. We want to extend that over time to be supported also in natural language. So those synonyms that we showed in Tableau prep can be used in Ask Data. And besides geography, there's things like dollars and customers and all that sort of thing, and really the ability to customize that semantic model to your own data, right? the characteristics of a customer in your company may not be the same as the characteristics of a customer in another company. And so the ability to customize that semantic model to your own data will be really critical. And then it really makes that mapping to these words and the questions you have richer, and Tableau is able to understand them even better. And then finally, the richer data model that we also talked about, being able to understand the context of the measurements, right? So this idea of, the employee salary, if I have this data source which is about sales, and I have linked in these employees who made the sales, and I happen to know their salary information along with that, the ability to just reach in and grab that and use it without having to remember to do an LOD calculation around it to make sure that it's not replicated. And really, one of the big outcomes, I think, of that feature is that we'll be able to answer more questions with a single data source. Today, if you have a bunch of different questions, if you have employee questions and sales questions and customer questions, you need at least 3 data sources probably. Because if you try to use one data source, then you get all these replication messes. So by having a richer data model, you can take virtually all the data in your organization, put it into a single data source with all of the relationships understood by Tableau, and be able to answer questions and have Tableau natively understand how the different measures are related to the fields. And so when you ask questions that involve both employees and customers, it will do the right thing. If you have questions that are only about employees, it will still do the right thing. Okay. So I wanted to leave you with a couple of other sessions that might be interesting. Sessions about table calcs and sets, which I touched on in relation to a few of these. Like I said, I didn't go into any detail on how to use any features of Tableau. There's lots of talks about those sorts of things. Please do complete the survey, and I've got some time for questions if anybody has them. Thanks.